sorry. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Price. I'm Vice Chair of the City Club of Cleveland Youth Forum Council and a senior at Shaw High School. Thank you for attending today's City Club of Cleveland Youth Forum on Breaking the Code of Silence, Police Relations. Today's forum will be full of dialogue from our amazing panelists. Each and every year, the City Club of Cleveland Youth Forum Council meets to plan and facilitate and produce City Club Youth Forums for other high school students where we determine various topics and invite esteemed panelists like today. With Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Freddie Gray are just three names at that, within the past year have brought to light the issue of police brutality and race in the United States. Across the country, police departments have been forced to examine multiple instances of excessive force, and the response to these instances have varied. Some departments have even mandated cameras, while others have called for better training, and unfortunately, some still have ignored it. The Department of Justice and the City of Cleveland entered into a consent decree, in which the DOJ will oversee the Cleveland Police Department. Today, you will have the opportunity to meet Mr. Mark Naymik, Metro Columnist of the Northeast Ohio Media Group, and he's been with the Plain Dealer since 2001 and has been reporting multiple stories pertaining to state, county, and city politics. Mr. James Hardiman, a civil rights attorney and educator who has dedicated his life to improving communities within Ohio. He is known for representing the plaintiffs in the case of Robert Anthony Reed versus James A. Rhodes, a pinnacle case that focused on the desegregation of the Cleveland public schools. And Mr. Ralph Spotts, Chief Ralph Spotts, former and retired Chief of Police for the City of East Cleveland, who has dedicated his life to protecting and serving many communities within the city of East Cleveland. On behalf of the entire City Club of Cleveland Youth Forum Council, thank you for joining us today, as this will be our last forum of 2015, and hope that you will stay tuned for future City Club Friday forums and City Club Youth Forums as well. Now I will turn today's forum over to my fellow council member, young activist herself, and moderator of today's forum, Ms. Danielle Harris. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Danielle Harris, and I am a junior at Cleveland Early College High School at John Hay campus. And I was the forum director for this forum, and I'm very excited to be your moderator. I would like to thank everyone who attended today's forum, as well as our panelists who have joined us to speak on such a contingent topic. Our youth council and we collaborated to make a list of questions, and I'm going to try to stick to them. However, we want this to flow as a conversation, so I might go off script just a little bit. Okay, just to begin. When you hear the words police brutality, what comes to mind? What does it mean to you, and why does police brutality exist?
Well, I guess I'll start off. I think it exists.
Thank you.
I think it exists because we let it exist. Many of you may recall the Rodney King incident of, was that 21 years ago or thereabouts? And Rodney King was kind of a pivotal incident in our history. That didn't start police brutality or excessive force or police misconduct, but it became significant because it was the first time that we were able to record the actual incidents of police misconduct. So now that everyone has a cell phone, we are in a position where most of what is done is now recorded by somebody. Many police officers or police cars have video cams. The Cleveland Police have body cameras. So I think this is a new era in which there is a lot more attention focused on police misconduct. But it's not to suggest that all police are bad, not by any stretch of the imagination. We depend on police, and I have a number of very, very good friends that are police officers, but it is a situation that we have to address if we're going to continue to move forward.
When I hear the words police brutality, obviously I'm thinking about it through the lens of a reporter. So that means accountability, accessibility. Is there a pattern? What can we learn about the underlying incident? Who was there? What public records can we chase to get to see if there is a larger story to be told? It's one thing to look at it, in a small box of what happened, but as reporters and as the plain dealer has shown in the past, for example, we have analyzed incidences of excessive force. And a lot of people forget, but even several years before the U.S. Justice Department came in, we looked at the use of force. There were 2 reporters that spent a lot of time, and some of those reports and the reporting that we did are actually cited in the U.S. Justice report that led to the consent decree. So when I hear those terms, I'm trying to look at the big picture and what we can add to it, because we're not investigators. We're not going to be able to determine whether the officer, should face charges. That's not our role. But I think there is always a larger picture there.
I also look at it from 2 angles. Being a police officer for 25 years, you see both sides of it. And the other side is a lot of people don't see how many times police officers get injured or hurt when they're involved in confrontations with people. That usually leads to where, when you talk about excessive force, which is a big problem and has always been a problem, but most people feel that police officers are trained a special way, or they have some special talent that they can overcome everybody, or they can, in any type of physical struggle, they can automatically, take that person down without anybody getting injured. And that's just truly not the case. More often than not, police officers are injured in those same incidents. It's a matter of everybody looks at what happens to the citizen, but nobody looks at what happens to the police officer. In most cases, nobody even cares what happens to the police officer. But as policemen, too often you see situations where more people are involved. In other words, when you say excessive, it could be 2 or 3 or 4 officers trying to take one person down, and it takes sometimes 2 or 3 or 4. And in that case, usually that person is going to get hurt one way or another. So it does become excessive in a lot of people's mind, when it really is, that's what it took. These real extreme cases where you see an officers shooting individuals like what you just seen lately, that's a whole different scenario. That's something that everybody has to play a part in, trying to change that culture. Police officers have in the past have looked at it more or less as us against them. It's overstated when you can use "I fear for my life." It's a catch-all. It's a get out of jail, phrase. In other words, for an officer to always roll back on why I was in fear of my life, when in fact it was nothing to be in fear of. But the overlining factors right now, we have to look at the relations between the community and the police departments and try to work towards solving some of these situations.
Okay, thank you. Going off of what you said about excessive force, why is it that you believe that certain cases are pinpointed as being injustices as opposed to other cases where officers have simply made a mistake?
I'll let you go first on that.
Well, I think we have a tendency to look a lot harder or more closely at police officers today than we ever did before. Excessive force is kind of a broad term, because now we fully expect police officers to be teachers, in some cases babysitters, arbiters as to what's right or wrong. And oftentimes a police officer has the ability to de-escalate a potentially volatile situation as opposed to making it even worse. Depending on how a police officer approaches a person, oftentimes will determine whether or not it becomes a situation in which it gets out of hand, as opposed to simply, hi, how are you doing? What can I help you with? That type of attitude oftentimes will generate a similar response. On the other hand, swearing, cursing, showing that you're the bully, you're the toughest guy on the block, will oftentimes generate that response in return. And I think that that's something that all law enforcement officials, all people that are sworn to protect and serve, have to work on and have to learn how to deal with people. Because as I said initially, now that we have cell phones, a lot of what went unreported before is going to become known.
Jim hit on a lot of issues, and especially something I'm sure we'll get to more in detail is on the community policing and the relationship between the public and the police. But you're asking that what makes the difference between an incident and something that's a mistake? Well, one, as Jim said earlier, video footage. And everybody here is going to see video footage differently. So it's not going to, that makes it complicated, that makes it more volatile, because you all are going to look at an incident and think from your standpoint, that officer did something wrong, he fired. And as we've seen in cases, there's a lot more to it from the officer's perspective. But I think video has made things more of an issue right now. Officers are allowed to make mistakes. They do make mistakes, and they don't always end up in the public eye, nor does it result in death. But I think the video has made the difference, and everything now is being seen as a big deal, even when we don't know all the facts behind it.
I think when you talk, excuse me, when you talk about mistakes in law enforcement, that mistake could cost you your life, opposed to just as you may take somebody else, like those split-second decisions. A lot of people don't understand that because they've never been in it. But I have been in many of those situations where it's that you got that much time to decide what you're going to do based on what that person may do. And if you make the wrong decision, it could cost you. But what we're seeing now is a lot of the just things that are not bad decisions or mistakes. They're just, when you say injustice, they're dead wrong in what they're doing. So they're two total different things. But in law enforcement, you're going to make mistakes on judgment calls. You're going to be in situations where, especially depending on where you work, quite often in a city like Cleveland or East Cleveland, we're dealing with issues every day. Whereas people had weapons, people were on drugs, different things, ready to fight the police, don't want to go to jail. And you got to make a lot of decisions based on just that amount of time, and it's not easy to do. But the injustice type things that we're seeing is a total different level. It should be looked at totally different, and it should be dealt with totally different.
Okay. I heard brief discussion at the head table about Tamir Rice, and going back to the split-second decisions. What was your reaction to the Tamir Rice footage and the Tamir Rice case?
Look, I have the easiest job. Hardest job, second hardest job, because Jim is involved. I get to be the armchair quarterback. I was in the command center when they first showed that footage of the Tamir Rice. The plain dealer went to court to get that video released because we felt that it was a public record. The city held it for a while. I did not watch it and think the police were justified or not justified, because there were so many things going on, and I saw the full video. The before the police show up, what happens after the police show up, and then what happens after the shot. We saw that, so I had a lot of questions. I really go back and forth as a columnist, where I'm allowed to have an opinion on whether I think it was justified or not. I have a hard time getting over the fact that the officers initially reported that they gave 3 commands to Tamir to raise his arms. I find that hard to believe in the short amount of time between the car door opening and the shots fired. I think that's something that the expert reports are examining, and I think we'll see a grand jury look at. And we'll see that issue addressed, regardless of what happens with the grand jury, by the city of Cleveland's police department on whether they followed protocol, dereliction of duty. All kinds of charges could be related to that protocol of the car driving up, all of those things. But those aren't necessarily criminal issues for the grand jury. But I guess your question is, what was my reaction? I had far more questions than the answers, but I felt the timing of it seems to bother me the most. There was no question he had a gun, and he waved it in the parking lot, because you see that on the footage. And there's no way you would know that it's real or not real. And we know that the information that the caller made to 911 dispatch did suggest that there could be a toy. Again, I don't even like using the word toy, because that doesn't represent what that replica pellet gun is. You can't tell the difference if you saw him sitting on the table in front of you when that fluorescent tip is removed. But that information about a possible replica gun did not get passed to the officer. So all of those things begin to change. When you watch the video, you don't know all of that. So I wouldn't want to be the grand jury. I wouldn't want to be anywhere involved in that case, because it is complicated, and obviously, the family itself is the one that is bearing all of the responsibility and emotional pain on it.
There are two issues that are going to arise out of this Tamir Rice case. One will be whether or not the police officers that were involved were criminally responsible for his death. The second issue is whether or not the police officers and the city of Cleveland will be financially obligated to reimburse or compensate the mother. No matter what happens, at the end of the day, a 12-year-old child lost his life. And no matter what happens, whether the police officers are indicted and ultimately prosecuted, whether they are convicted or exonerated, that's not going to bring Tamir Rice back. No matter how much money the mother, the family, the survivors receive, that's not going to bring Tamir Rice back. There will be additional training that Cleveland police will have to undergo as a result of the settlement agreement and consent decree with the Department of Justice. There will be more community relations outreach. There will be an attempt to sensitize police officers. The big question that I have insofar as the Tamir Rice situation is concerned is, why did the police officers drive up that close if they thought something was going on? And if they thought something was going on, why did they have to shoot first and then ask questions later? So at the end of the day, a 12-year-old child lost his life, and it could have been any one of you, because I would suggest, or probably, I probably know, most of you have played with guns before. Not real guns, but toy guns, cap guns, water guns. That's not an excuse, and I think everybody that has looked at this has come to the conclusion that some mistakes were made. The real issue is whether those mistakes will rise to the level of criminal or civil liability.
In East Cleveland, I saw that same exact situation happen to a 13-year-old kid. Whereas he was playing with a gun with a kid on walking to school, police were called, police pulled up behind him and got out of the car, told him to turn around. And when he turned around, the gun was in his waistband, and he reached for it. And I know the kid because I taught him in DARE. And I'm sure that he was grabbing it to show the police officer this is fake. But at the time he grabbed it, the officer shot him. Shot him in the chest and killed him. And of course, it ruined the officer's career. 13-year-old was dead for nothing. And as soon as this situation happened, that's what I thought about. And everything has not really been put out as to what really happened, as far as the information the police had or didn't have. But like he stated, nowhere would you be trained to rush up on somebody that you think has a gun. And that's what everybody has to look at, is why did they pull up right to him if he had a weapon? Because that just put that officer that was on the driver's side, if anybody looked at the video, I'm sure everybody has, when he's walking up toward him and he reaches, whatever he was gonna do, obviously he wasn't pulling out to shoot anybody, because it's not a gun. But just the fact that he did that, that officer pretty much had no choice but to make that split-second decision. Ultimately, everything about the situation is wrong. And like he stated, at the end, a 12-year-old kid is dead from that. So one thing I speak to people about continuously is, what are we going to get from this and learn from this so this type thing doesn't happen again? But since we don't know what the result is, all we can really look at is the tragedy in itself. Everything that happened kind of came together, was wrong. And the end result was, like you said, a young kid is dead because of it.
Chief Spots, I've seen some psychological tests that have been administered, and you may be familiar with some of them, and they will flash a picture of a person, and they'll flash a picture of a white person reaching for a cell phone. And they'll flash the same picture of a black person reaching for a cell phone. And the respondent is to decide whether or not they're reaching for a cell phone or a weapon and fire, depending on what they're reaching for. And most of those studies have documented the fact that when the person reaching for the cell phone is black, the probability that the responding person is going to shoot is significantly higher. Now, I don't know if that suggests that we have subliminal racism at work, but the reality is that when a young black, particularly male, reaches for something and may be doing something completely innocent, the probability is much greater that they're going to be met with deadly force. That's just the reality. And it's not just by white police officers. It's by both white and black police officers. They will tend to shoot the black male a lot faster than they will shoot the white male.
Well, the reality that is absolutely true. And anybody who thinks anything different is either fooling themselves or really not realistic. That's just an unfortunate fact. And is it fair? No. It's the stereotypes, it's the mindset. And when I would interview officers coming in, a lot of officers, one of the main questions I ask them is, have you ever, these would be Caucasian officers especially, have you ever been in a community with African Americans? Have you ever even been in school with them? You know, have you ever worked with them? And a lot of times they haven't. And now they're coming into an inner city where they have all these preconceived notions or stereotypical thoughts about how young, especially young black men act or what young black men are doing. And that's a real problem that we're facing all over. And that's something that everybody's trying to figure a way around. But when you talk about those type of tests, they do prove, I'm sure they prove that. And unfortunately, that's just how a lot of people think. That's the reality of it. So for somebody to lie and say that's not true, that's exactly what they're doing. They're lying. That is the reality of it. And it's not just, as he said, white officers. Black officers, you know, think the same thing quite often. Or, well, I know these guys over here, they're always selling drugs. Or these guys are doing that wrong. And they actually approach situations just like that. And that's a horrible way to have to approach it. But, you know, it's something that, you know, you're fighting with, trying to figure out how to handle it. And it's just one of those things that there is no real definitive answer.
So what is it that you all believe we could do to combat this mindset, if anything?
Wow.
All right, well, I'll start on this one. I think as a member of the media, we have the ability to influence. And I think making our reporting more reflective, accurate, and inclusive. And that means portraying a broader variety of stories, both about, you know, whether it's the city, crime, whatever. Continue to do the investigative reporting, looking at biases in police reporting, which is an issue that gets a lot of attention in the consent decree. Cleveland had actually never tracked even the traffic stops by race or you know, looking at patterns in there. And they will be forced to do that now, is actually keep records of these stops that don't necessarily lead to anything, but why were they stopped? You know, you don't stop a black driver and then cite him for no seatbelt. And I think that's the kind of thing that the consent decree will say, that you won't even be able to give them the secondary, the seatbelt violation if there was no legitimate reason to stop. And we need to look at that. And our job in the media, obviously, to be the watchdog, that's at least what we can do, is begin to highlight that, press the responsible parties to do that kind of reporting and tracking. But man, that's a big question.
That's kind of an interesting take on a really, really big issue. Prior to the time most of you were born, when we saw television, we never saw anybody of color. I think the first such show was the Bill Cosby show, when we saw responsible, professional black people. So all that to say, we have come a long way since those days when there were preconceived
I know
notions.
everybody's giggling in there on Bill Cosby because of the way that term. But
I knew that was going to generate
yes,
that
yes,
response.
but
You don't want to say that.
Before he became more famous for
Yes.
what he did.
but you're right. That's
But Bill Cosby and the Cosby Kids, that was the first time that black people were shown in a positive light. I was looking at some old movies just recently. Elvis Presley, Jailhouse Rock, which was long before your parents were born. They've got a jail, but no black people were in the jail. It was all white. And you know, I think that we as a society have got to accept the fact that we have to become more pluralistic. And in our schools, we've got to teach tolerance. We've got to teach people that there's not a whole lot of difference between black people and white people. And just because you're black doesn't mean you can play basketball and dance. And just because you're white doesn't mean that you should be on the school newspaper. It does suggest that we've got a problem with the stereotypes that have been developed over the years. And a police officer that approaches 3 or 4 young black men with saggy pants, is that a cause to stop them, to start to hassle them, to conduct a warrantless search of them, to arrest them for something? Of course not. The Fourth Amendment prohibits that type of activity. But a lot of people, including people that should know better, believe that that's the only way we're going to make society safer. And a lot of young black males are going to be the victims of those types of thoughts. So we've got to start somewhere. Do we start in the elementary school? Do we start in the high schools? Do we start in college maybe? Do we have more programs like DARE? Do we send police officers into the community? Is training necessary? Will it help? Will it teach people that they've got to overcome their stereotypes of what other people are like? And it's a huge problem, but it's one that you, when I say you, all of you that don't even remember the Bill Cosby show, will have to address.
I would add to that in saying that like this forum right here is so right on time and at this point in time. And it's really this generation that you're in that's gonna make this or break this. Because what I'm saying is, and this is what I try to implore to young people, right now is the time to understand, one, and we teach this class, like what to do when stopped by the police, or how to handle any incident in which you're dealing with the police. And a lot of us don't understand the right way to do it. And unfortunately, no matter what you want to say, if you respond differently or the wrong way, you're giving police officers the opportunity to react to what you do. And that's usually when something is going to go wrong. You're going to always have police officers, like in every other profession, that don't do things right from the beginning. Like he said, they may stop you, mess with you for no reason. But it's how do you handle that? That's going to make the difference in the change, because if I'm that officer that just wants to pick with you because, or I'm that racist officer, or I'm that bully, and I can just, all I need to do is get you to say something or do something wrong. Now you give me a right to grab you, to hit you, or do whatever I want to do and try to write my way out of it. So this is the type of forum that we want young people, and if, just like this group right here, when you go back to your schools, and you know, when you start working and talking with your other students, we have to relay that to everybody. And as a you know, not just police departments working, but communities working together to rid some of this, because it's gonna start to come to an end real quick, because like you said, with all these cameras, now everybody has cameras, the audio officers are now, within the next year, everywhere gonna have to wear video cameras on their body, which will show everything they do or don't do. The dash cam cameras, everybody has phones that have cameras. So this stuff is gonna gradually come to an end. But the youth of today can really make a big impact on how things happen in the future with police relations.
To close,
Give us an easy question, please.
This is pretty easy. How far do you believe we have truly come as it relates to police relations, and how do we help people realize that there is still more to be done?
Well, I'm old enough to remember Emmett Till, Mississippi Burning, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, and even a time when East Cleveland was an overwhelmingly white, segregated city. We've come a long way. The stereotypes of the 60s, in many cases, no longer exist. So there has been substantial progress. When I was a young lawyer, we filed a lawsuit against the city of Cleveland to have them hire more African American police officers. And they did. Now, some of them were just as bad as the white officers they were replacing, but they did at least change the complexion of much of the police force. So I think we have come an awful, awful long way. I was watching To Kill a Mockingbird, and if you haven't seen it, look at it sometime. Just recently, it was on Saturday night. So we've made substantial progress. The old days when the police officers would give you what became known as the third degree, I'm not so naive as to say it doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist as much as it used to. So things are a lot different today. Now, how far do we have to go to have a completely bias-free police department, not just in the city of Cleveland, but in every police department across the United States? We've got a long, long, long way to go. And unfortunately, in many cases, it's us against them. And unless or until that mentality is changed, we're going to continue to have problems.
I'll step back just 1 year and answer your question about how far we've come. Since Tamir Rice shooting, at least there has been a substantial discussion on improving community police relations, even before the Justice Department and the consent decree came out and really highlighted those issues. Years ago, cities had more money and more police officers, so that idea stereotyped in old movies of cops walking the beat, knowing the neighbors, shaking hands and getting to know people, that's been gone for decades. But the fact that we're now in a discussion about how to get officers out of their car and to take their sunglasses off and to engage in the people in their communities and hire more people from the community, that's a lot. I've been covering this stuff for 20-some years, and the fact that we've had a lot of this issue itself, community policing, forums from the NAACP, the ACLU, community relations meetings. I was out just 2 weeks ago watching Police Chief Calvin Williams. He's from Glenville, was in Glenville, and one of the questions from the people that were there was, again, on community policing. He didn't think police officers engaged people enough. Chief Williams called that individual to the front. He wasn't a Cleveland resident, but he was an activist. And then he called the officers from the back of the room to the front and said, I want you to meet him, shake hands, look each other in the eye, and go talk. It's a little step, but these things weren't going on more than a year ago. And we're going to see more. So in that little window, we've made some progress, but obviously talking isn't really going to deliver action, but it is the first step.
I remember when I was 12, me and a couple of friends rode our bike up in, and I was born and raised in East Cleveland, up in the Heights there, and the police pulled us over, ran us through everything just to check on our bikes, because we were black kids riding our bikes up, and white kids riding all over the place. They ain't stopped nobody, but they stopped us. And I remember telling my dad about it, and he was telling me how things used to be and how they're going to get better. He also told me the Browns will win the championship soon. That was over 40 years ago. Still ain't happened. And in a lot of areas, it has gotten better, but in a lot of areas, it hasn't. And again, it's a process. It's a horrible process, but as long as you get a bad apple here, a bad apple there, a lot of people can't handle pressure. A lot of officers a lot of them are racist. A lot of them are bullies. A lot of them are thieves. A lot of them are the biggest problem is most times people are cowards. They're afraid. And when they're afraid of that situation or that guy that they got to try to arrest or somebody says, I'm not going to jail, and now you got to either fight with that person, that the fear comes in, which means you go to that next level, which a lot of times the officer will use a weapon. And as long as you have those situations, but understand it's not just in law enforcement, it's in everything. In every facet of life, you have those same issues. Just like we have racism in every other thing, you got racism in law enforcement. So until and this sounds corny, but until people as a country together starts knocking down some of them barriers, you're going to still have these problems in law enforcement just like you do everywhere else. And the last quick thing I'll say is every time an officer does something wrong, it's all over the news. All over the news, it's just blown out there for everybody to see. And hardly ever do you see things reported on the things that officers do every day that are good. You'll never see that. So everybody in here could be a police officer and be doing a good job. He could do something stupid and wrong, and that's all you're going to hear about, is that one officer, what he did, and he made this mistake, or he shot somebody, and nothing's covered about all the good things that other officers do in some of them same situations. So that's one of the problems I blame the media about, and I've always said that about the media, because they never want to show anything positive. And all people see is the negative, and that's all that's in their mind. But as far as it changing anytime soon, honestly, and a lot of things are going to get better, but I don't really see the overall change within the next few years.
Thank you. This concludes our moderated portion. Joe.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Baruch. I'm a junior at Shaker Heights High School and also a member of the City Club Youth Forum Council. Today we're enjoying a Youth Forum panel discussion on police relations featuring, as we said before, James Hardiman, a civil rights attorney, Mark Naymik, Metro reporter for the Northeast Ohio Media Group, and Ralph Spotts, retired chief of police for the city of East Cleveland. Our moderator is Youth Forum Council member and John Hay Early College student, Danielle Harris. And so right now we want to encourage you to formulate questions for our speakers and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. Brief and to the point. If you're joining us via webcast, and people do that, believe me, and you want to tweet a question, please tweet it at City Club Youth or anything else you feel like mentioning to us. And we want to welcome welcome all of you here and those joining us via the web stream provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Production, distribution, and broadcast of the City Club programs are made possible by CSU and PNC. Today's forum is also sponsored by AT&T, and we thank you for your support. Now it's time to return to our panel for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from anyone and everyone, including guests. So holding the microphones today and allowing you to ask your questions are Logan and Tiolu. And so we'll take the first question whenever you're ready.
Hi, my name is Tyler Woody of Shaw High School. I'm in the criminal justice program and I'm in the 11th grade. My question is for all three of you. Do you really ever think that blacks and whites will ever honestly be treated equal? Like ever? And that's with any other race too. So that's my question.
The Constitution, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution required equal protection under the law. That was in 1868, following the Civil War. And we've been, since that time, trying to get a handle on what that really means. And when Barack Obama was elected president, a lot of people said we now live in a post-racial society. That was a joke. We have a long, long, long way to go because, unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that black people still, I don't mean, when I say black, I mean brown people as well, are still oftentimes the last to be hired, the first to be fired. They live by a different standard. And unless or until we come to grips with this and have some honest discussions on race, then we're not going to ever overcome some of the problems. Now, we've come a long way. You probably don't stay up long enough at night to see Olivia and the president having their relationship. But if that had occurred 25, 30 years ago, it would have been front page news. Now Olivia is having an illicit relation. Olivia's a black woman, in case those of you that don't watch Scandal. Is a black woman having a relationship with the president who happens to be white. And it's kind of accepted that this is, a normal situation. And who would have ever thunk it 30 years ago? I think the first time a black woman and a white man ever kissed on television was on a Star Trek program. And it was phenomenal that this can happen. Now we just take it for granted. So yes, we've made a lot of progress, but unfortunately we've got a long, long, long way to go.
I don't want to be Pollyannish. I can't say it's going to happen, especially not in my lifetime. But yeah, we've got a long way to go.
The reality of it is, I would say it won't happen as long as we're alive, because it's so many issues and they keep coming up, and it's the way people have been raised and the way people think. And just to be honest, I still deal with it myself. It's not just the average person on the street. It's still with everybody in different walks of life. So I don't see it going away. Unfortunately, no.
Next question.
How's everybody doing today? My name is Daryl Wright, and I go to John F. Kennedy High School. I'm a sophomore. My question is for the retired chief of police. Is there no procedure to get rid of these bad cops and these cops who are just out here and they aren't treating people fair? Because I know every cop isn't treating everybody right. I know it's still people out here shaking people down for no reason, and still, especially in East Cleveland, because I done had a couple run-ins with the East Cleveland Police Department where I didn't do anything and they just shook me up for nothing and found out that I didn't have anything and I was just on my way to the library.
Well, it's a lot of things that cause both sides of that, but the main thing is educating people on what to do when they come in situations like that. To just be quick about it. If an officer does something that's illegal or against your rights, first of all, do you know your rights? That's one of the things that we try to really impose on young people. Do you actually even know your rights, what they are? And if your rights are violated by police officers, then what do? And the case like in East Cleveland, a lot of people would never follow through with making even complaints. They wouldn't go to the internal affairs. They didn't want to write it down what happened. Thus, that means it didn't happen. So one of the main things that we have to do when you're talking about officers that are doing wrong is identify when it happens and follow up on it and press it. And it could be the little thing, not just if they shoot and kill somebody, but something like that. If the officers were dead wrong in that, you have to follow through with that. And unfortunately, most of the people in the inner city communities, they just don't follow through what really their rights are.
It is very difficult to get rid of a bad police officer. And in many cases, it is based on the fact that they have a very, very strong and effective union. So that if an administrative official decided that he had a bad cop, that cop still has certain rights under his collective bargaining agreement. And one of the things that they found when they negotiated the consent decree was that all of these complaints that were made to Civilian Review Board and the Office of Professional Standards were just made and nothing ever happened. The vast majority of those complaints just died on the vine. Now that we have a consent decree, at least in Cleveland, there's going to be more accountability. And there have to be some revisions so that it's not just a case where if you got beat up by a cop, but if you got stopped by a cop for no reason, then you have a basis to make a complaint. Will you make the complaint? Will you follow through on it? Does that police officer have a track record of doing that same thing? You got baggy pants, so you must have broken some law somewhere, and they can shake you down for that. Well, that's obviously illegal, but it's also immoral. And we've got to start to become much more vigilant to make sure that these kinds of things do not continue to happen.
brotherhood to them basically. They all have the same job, especially if you've been working there for multiple years. How long were you?
25.
25 years. If you knew somebody even more than 5 years, that's like your brother to you, basically, even if you family or not. So what's the chances that if I do write a report, that something will happen about it, or that it will be looked at, or that anything will happen, anything will change?
In Cleveland, there was absolutely no chance that anything would change up until just recently. Now we've got a procedure in place where we have to revise the Office of Professional Standards, the Civilian Review Board. All of these complaints have to be tracked now. They can't be, put in a desk drawer or a circular file and forgotten about. But you're absolutely right. Up until just recently, nothing was going to happen. Now, hopefully, this is a new day. We still have to stick around and continue to make those complaints to determine whether or not we can effect some meaningful change.
Hi, I'm Kevin E. Gilmore, child welfare advocate for foster care and adoption. One, I respect your honesty, all three of you, because it takes honesty for us to get somewhere. The population that I work with, which are foster youth, 36% of them when they age out go to prison. So when I think about a foster child responding to the police, oftentimes the trauma that they've witnessed in a home or when police come on scene, they respond accordingly. Do you think the police officers will be trained, trauma-focused trained? Because even for me, I grew up in care. When police come, I instantly get an attitude. It's almost like breathing because of the things I've saw over time pertaining to when the police show up. And I think that happens a lot when you see the police because of things that they saw at their home. How they respond to the police is almost like breathing. They can't even help how they respond to them. And I think it's the same thing with the officer. So are they getting trauma training so they can know what a child or an adult hears in their head when they see them come on to a scene or come, for something?
You're hitting on a really important issue and one that is addressed in the consent decree. While it focuses a little more on mental health training, but the city has, I think, about 180 days to come up with a plan for retraining the officers and how to pull together social workers and others when they are on responding to, typically a domestic situation that involves someone that has some special needs. And that right now, I think only about half of our officers get the kind of training for mental health. That has to change. That's going to, I think, is required to go to the police force wide in the training. They have to, correct me if I'm wrong, they have to have a intervention specialist or coordinator for the police department now that will, again, try to address a little bit of that issue. Again, it's a little more focused on mental health, but the idea that they're going to be more active in trying to pull a broader net of social work and help into a response. And the police department is trying to give more attention to priority 1 and 2 calls so that they can actually give a greater response. Now, what has happened as a result right now is that then people that have called in with priority 3 and 4, which are like vandalism and other things, they're complaining that no one's coming back. And the city will acknowledge that and say, well, we're really focused on 1 and 2, which is, threats of harm and these more serious situations, but they want to be more engaged. And that does have to happen. But we probably have to sacrifice some quality of life issues that we want the police to deal with in order to deal with the more serious stuff.
I think also there are training sessions with a lot of everything from cultural diversity, like you said, dealing with a lot of mental problems now, but they're just training. But also that's from the police end. But again, citizens have to understand, and if it was possible to train citizens on how to react again when you come across the police, 'cause exactly what you said is true. A lot of people, as soon as the police arrive, have this automatic, they hate the police. Don't say nothing to, they already have such a negative response before the police even say anything. And whether you want to believe this, understand it, if I approach you and you just had that attack attitude towards me, then that's going to put my guard up against you. And it's going to kind of have a way to deal how I respond to you. I ask this quick question to everybody in here. This is what I deal with my kids all the time. If the police saw you walking down the street and got out of the car and asked you your name, do you have to give it to them? And see, most people think they don't, but actually you do. And again, it's a matter of, do you know your rights and do you know the rights of the police officer? Because they can ask that. But if that happens, if it's a fight after school and the police comes, hey, you guys got to move, and they say, why we got to move? We ain't doing nothing. You can't make us move. I'm waiting on, that is automatically a defiant towards an authority figure of the police. Now, when they keep trying to get you to move, you don't move. What happens if they touch you? Now you swinging at them. Now you giving them a right to grab you and throw you to the ground. But that's a situation, again, of the miscommunication and misunderstanding, and how one thing can go with your attitude, and I'm just saying the public's attitude is so negative toward the police right now, is making the police have a worse attitude in how they dealing with the public. And that's really making it worse at this point. So that's why we have to try to come across now and say, hey, don't do this, the police can't do that, and that's where the bigger problem is.
I've covered the ACLU's training a little bit on how to interact with police officers, and the bottom line is follow their commands. If you believe they're wrong, make your case after the incident. You don't make your case that they're wrong during the traffic stop, because things don't usually end well that way. I mean, the argument is you have a lot of rights, but you got to know when you follow them through, and you do have to respond to an officer's command.
One more
Jim,
quick
you
point
can
on
correct
it.
me on this, or
They have guns.
yeah.
You don't.
The last point I want to make on that is, and this is in response to what the young man said, as the chief, I got so many complaints constantly from folks that the police just ride by. They riding by people doing this, they riding by the guys on the corners, they riding by this, that, and that. They not stopping nobody, they not checking nobody. A lot of times when the police pull up on you, if it's 3 or 4 guys standing there, unfortunately people have called the police on you. And that's what you might not understand or know. People at that house that you're in front of, when they're going to say, hey, these guys out here, they doing this or they doing that, or they always think you're about to fight, or they're about to break in somebody's house. So people calling the police on you. Now, if the police come and just keep going, now they throwing it at us, you're not doing nothing. We done called you 10 times. People just still out here hanging out all hours of the night. So the police get out to check you. You might not be doing anything wrong. And most times than not, you haven't. However, it's how you respond to that is what's going to happen next.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Gardner. I go to Jane Adams Business Career Center. And as we were talking about how the training for police officers. Is there a way that we can we can consider the way we hire police officers, and if so, why don't we consider hiring ones who are less inducive for racism?
Police officers are hired based on an application, a competitive civil service examination, and ultimately an appointment. They are supposed to receive psychological screening. But looking back, we know that in a lot of cases, the right questions were not asked during this psychological screening process. And sometimes we don't know the right questions to ask. Obviously, we want to know that they're not a racist, they're not afraid, they don't grow marijuana in their backyard. We can find out about that kind of stuff. But to dig deep into a person's psyche and predict whether or not they will be or will not be a good police officer is extremely difficult. There are ways to do this, and I think that's what we've got to focus on. Hiring the police officers obviously is the first step. Training the police officers is the second step. And retraining and retraining and retraining some more, I think, is going to be the ultimate solution if we ever have one.
One other thing is there are very few people that want to go into law enforcement now, especially in minorities. But just ask yourself, because it's not the cool thing to do, but who wants to be a police officer? Very few people want to do that. And those would be the people that we would need in that profession if you want to see these things start to change over the time. And you look at a lot of communities, like I live in Richmond Heights, they don't have a black police officer. But the last test they had, not a black person took the test. Highland Heights doesn't have a black. University Heights just has one, and she just started. So a lot of communities outside of Cleveland and East Cleveland, inner city, they don't even have African American applying for the positions. So that could be one of the issues that we start to look at, is making it a field that people want to get into instead of people hate. You know, as growing up, and they say that's the last thing I want to be as a police officer.
I have a question for the chief. First, thanks for being here, everybody. The union president, Steve Loomis, said something recently that really bothered me. He talked about something that's being called the Ferguson effect, where police say they are hesitating before stopping anyone for fear they might get in trouble and not have the support of City Hall or the community. And Loomis said that everyone wants to go out there and proactively police. He said they're scared to do it. They're not going to do it, so they're staying in their cars. And I taught school for 40 years. If our union president said that the kids are misbehaving so much that teachers are going to decide they're not going to teach, they're just going to sit at the desk and just read a newspaper, you know, we would really be blasted for that. And so I want you to comment, to have a union president say, you know, they're staying in the cars because they don't want to get in trouble and because people are complaining about them. How do you feel about that announcement being made?
The reality, again, I just deal with the reality. I'm just saying, deal with the reality. The reality is, obviously, that would be a horrible thing to do. You saw that in Baltimore, if you paid attention. After the riots and everything in Baltimore, the crime rate went up dramatically because the police said we're not even going to address it. If that happens, we got the worst situation that we can possibly have. But the flip side to that is, if I'm an officer, again, and I have a situation, I pull her over, or I'm dealing with her, and she decides she wants to holler and scream at me and fight, if I grab her, I'm going to be the one to get in trouble. And it's almost like I have to prove to everybody that I didn't do anything wrong. And yet, you know, the way people are being, you know, pushed into situations sometimes, that's what they're afraid of. And that's a real fear. It's just like, I don't want to chase nobody that's stolen a car no more, because if he crashed, they're going to blame me. I don't want to chase this kid in this backyard that's running from me at nighttime, because if I catch him, it's just me and him in that backyard. So something's going to happen. And if I have to use a weapon, or if I hurt him, then everybody's going to blame me. So it's almost like, let him go. And that way I don't have to deal with it. I don't have to go through no civil court. I don't have to go through, trying to get my name off. And unfortunately, that's the reality of how some people are beginning to think. So instead of deal with that guy with a gun that's running and have a confrontation where he might kill me still, or I might have to shoot him and get criticized for shooting him, I just let him go. And that's just unfortunate reality of how a lot of people are looking at some of these situations, especially right now, because they're scared to death of what's going to happen with the Tamir situation and what's happened already in the other situations. So the police are really hesitant right now.
I think that's unfortunate choice of words that Steve Loomis used, because it's an indictment on all the good police officers that are going to continue to try to do their jobs. And I think it will evolve into the self-fulfilling prophecy. When he says it, some police officers will do it, and then we will have not chaos, but something approaching chaos. So it's unfortunate that a union official, a responsible person, would make such a statement. And I think it's a sorry indictment on all the good police officers that are going to continue to do their jobs regardless of the consequences.
Merle, the good news is we've not seen any evidence with data that supports either what happened in Baltimore or what what Union President Loomis is saying. Certainly the attitude's there. I don't think you can dispute it. But the evidence isn't there that the officers are walking away or backing off. And we'll see over time.
Thank you so very much. This ends our question and answer portion.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kirsten Pamales and I am Secretary of the Youth Forum Council. I wanted to thank you guys all for coming today, and I also wanted to thank Danielle Harris, our wonderful moderator, along with James Hardiman, civil rights attorney, Mark Naymik, seasoned reporter for Cleveland.com, and Ralph Spots, retired chief of police. So once again, thanks for attending our forum. Oh wait, one more thing. Almost forgot. we have surveys, and if you guys could fill those out, they're under your plates, I believe. It'd be really great because this is a way for you guys to have an effect on what we talk about next. So you could talk about what you liked about this forum and make suggestions for the next. So now, thank you for attending, and our forum is now adjourned.
Anthony, she hit it hard.